Tēnā koutou e tiwi, nau mai haere mai, ki tēnei momo kaupapa, tēnei momo kaupapa ki te whakawhiti whakaaro, ki te whakawhiti kōrero, e pāna ki te take kei mui a tātou. Anei ngā mihi maioha no mātou no te whare wānanga o Waikato, kia koutou. I raro hoki te mana o tūheitia me te kāhui a Riki, pai mārire kia rātou, me ki anō, tēnā no tātou katoa. Welcome everybody. We're really very excited to be hosting this forum that allows us to share thoughts, share stories, share discussions, and hopefully to help progress the urgent action that is needed as COP. This morning we were welcomed and blessed by our kaumātua Taki Turner, and we also heard from Vice-Chancellor Professor Neil Quigley, Margaret Evans, former mayor but very active citizen, and during which she acknowledged the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, with whom we are partnering with to produce this forum over the next 2 weeks. We also want to honour the work also of Zena Daish, who was very instrumental in the leadership of CHEC, as I said, the Commonwealth of Human Ecology Council. This afternoon we have a great lineup of speakers for you all, from scientists to local body councillors to our own Professor Tom Raw as well. So we're going to come from a variety of disciplines to share our thoughts with you in our short time. First up though, we are very honoured that we have with us Honorary Nanaia Mahuta, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Local Government, Associate Minister for Māori Development, and of course our MP here for Hauraki Waikato. We are fortunate that she has created this space to give us a short little kōrero and summary from a government perspective. And if there's a couple of things I'd just like to say about Nanaia, apart from her credentials, incredible credentials of whakapapa and genealogy and her time in local government, is the fact that we heard this morning about being local action and being globally informed, and I think if there's one person that epitomises that, that's you, Nanaia. You're very rooted in the flax roots and marae politics of your iwi, let alone other iwi. You're tested against the reality of what's happening there in the global world, as well as the tests within your own community. All the time you're uplifting and breaking down barriers to reduce those inequities that beset us all, and particularly in terms of the Māori and Indigenous communities. We welcome you to this forum. Ngā mihi ki a koe e te mātai kura, and we'll hand over to you. Tēnā koe.
Tēnā tātou, tui a te rangi e tui honei, tui a te papa e takoto nei. Tui a I te here tangata, kia hono I te wairua, kia rongo te pō, kia rongo te ao, he pō, he ao mārama, ti hei mauri ora. I'm pleased to join in this online forum associated with the commencement of COP26 hosted in Glasgow this year. Thank you to the University of Waikato and in particular Tom Raw for the invitation to join the opening ceremony. I want to also take a moment to recognise that we're at an important point in the world's history. I want to acknowledge other panellists who bring their particular experience and insight to the discussion that we're having over this 2-week period. I've been asked to offer some thoughts and set the scene regarding climate change, the New Zealand context, and also our international commitment to lift our ambition to meet the Paris Agreement goals. Leaders around the world are calling for action, but we have a significant role to play to ensure that words and actions reflect the level of concerted effort to tackle global emission and transition towards a low carbon economy. Our young people around the world are also calling for action. When I think about our own rangatahi here in Aotearoa, it's evident that they're calling for a sense of urgency and action on climate change. After all, they'll inherit the decisions we make. While we may only be a comparatively small contributor to global emissions, we are a food-producing nation, and we're surrounded by the blue ocean continent. Sea level rise will impact our way of life and those of our Pacific neighbours. Getting products to market, tackling methane emissions, and taking a resilience-focused approach to adaptation must be a core part of our domestic priorities as we take meaningful steps forward. This must be a decade of delivery across all major emitting sectors across the globe. We need to make clear there is a place for multilateral support to achieve this goal, and that's what COP26 is setting out to achieve. While acknowledging each country's different national circumstances, we will endeavour to work together in each sector, including through public-private collaboration and by mobilising finance at scale, to make the global transition to a clean economy faster, lower cost where significant gains can be made, while making solutions to adaptation more affordable and inclusive. New Zealand is taking action to reduce global emissions, ensure a fair and equitable transition of our economy, and build climate resilience both at home and abroad. We're fully committed to the Paris Agreement and intent on keeping the limit of 1.5 degrees warming within reach to prevent the worst effects of climate change, especially for the most vulnerable countries. It's important to recognise that as a country of the Pacific, our responsibility to advocate for greater ambition will also support our Pacific whanaunga, the Pacific nations who are disproportionately impacted by the actions of developed nations. I want to acknowledge our Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and Minister for Climate Change James Shaw. They have stewarded through important decisions that align our domestic focus. Decisions like the just transition to ensure that the economic benefits of technology enhancements support food production, alternative energy sources, resilient infrastructure, and planning solutions to support our international efforts. New Zealand has stepped up our increased our climate finance commitment to 1.3 billion in grant funding over the next 4 years between 2022 and 2025. This is more than 4 times the size of our 2018 commitment of 300 million. At least half of the total climate finance commitment is to go specifically towards supporting Pacific Island countries and at least 50% to adaptation. New Zealand's national circumstances and emissions profile present opportunity and challenge for reducing emissions. The updated NDC announced yesterday expressed a target to reduce net emissions by 50% below gross 2005 levels by 2030. This equates to a 41% reduction on 2005 levels using what is known as an emissions budget approach. We've put in place the architecture to manage our transition to a low emissions and climate resilience economy. Our approach is underpinned by science, independent advice from the Climate Commission, a strong focus on stakeholder consultation, and ensuring a fair and equitable transition. We've set a 2050 target based on IPCC pathways. Our 2050 target covers all gases, splitting them based on science. This is reflected as an absolute percentage reduction for biogenic methane and net zero for all other gases. New Zealand is mapping those long-term targets into short-term action. By May 2022, we'll have set out our domestic emissions budget out to 2035 and our first emissions reductions plan. This plan will outline tangible policies and measures that will enable us to meet our budgets and targets, with a particular focus on transport, energy, and industry. The emissions reduction plan will also serve as New Zealand's long-term low emissions development strategy and will be communicated to the UNFCCC in 2 stages. The first stage is now complete. We will probably be the first country in the world to price agricultural emissions from 2025 at the latest. We're working in partnership with the primary sector and Māori via He Waka Ike Noa to establish the best way to do this. I want to acknowledge Māori food producers, many of whom are leading the change towards regenerative farming practices. And this builds on the intergenerational perspective of kaitiakitanga. I want to acknowledge our academic and research institutions that champion research and development to reduce agricultural emissions. This includes through the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, of which New Zealand is a founding member. New Zealand is the first country to introduce legislation requiring mandatory climate-related finance disclosures. In the trade space, New Zealand is leading an approach where the alignment of trade and climate policy development through initiatives such as the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability and ongoing advocacy for fossil fuel subsidy reform. Climate resilience is also a core building block of our approach. Last year, we published our first comprehensive national climate change risk assessment to help New Zealand identify and prioritise action. We are now in the process of developing our first national adaptation plan, responding to the risks outlined in this assessment. As we listen to the signals at COP26 in the coming weeks from the international community, I'm sure and I'm mindful that we must make climate change relevant to the people here at home and in our communities. We need a cultural shift for people to understand how pressing, how urgent the need for change is. With cultural change comes behavioural change. And with that, we can harness Kiwi ingenuity, innovation. Our capacity to innovate and integrate bicultural values can aid more divergent solutions to the challenge of limiting the impacts on global warming. In closing, I'm aware that the approach taken by this government goes beyond tackling climate change alone. Our ambition is to catalyse the growth of markets, jobs and economic development globally for clean technologies and sustainable solutions, support the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, strengthen the climate resilience of our societies and realise multiple co-benefits such as cleaner air, water and better health. Climate change requires us to think about how we practice kaitiakitanga as stewards, rather than simply consumers. Māori have a unique perspective about kaitiakitanga and connectedness to one's life force. It is holistic and integrated. It is immediate and intergenerational. It is physical and intangible. It is complementary just as night joins day. The concept of all life forms is drawn from a sacred essence that is best encapsulated in the first breath of life. Mai I te whai au ki te ao marama, ti hei mauri ora. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa, and I wish you well for the rest of the hui. Kia ora rā.
Tēnā koe te marae kura ana ngā mahi mai o hā mō tērā kōrero hōhonu kia mātou, nō reira tēnā koe haere pai atu I runga I te rangi Māori e o a tātou tūpuna tēnā koe. So in my thanks to Nanaia, just to thank her again for her time and her clear articulation of the framework that the government intends to work under. I think in these times of uncertainty, it's very important and significant for us to hear very clear messages, and Nanaia has helped frame our discussions to come, as well as inform us with a lot more from the policy perspective of the government. Nō reira anō nei ngā mahi. We're turning now to our second speaker, Emeritus Professor Ian Douglas from the University of Manchester, UK, a world authority in terms of cities and built environment, and has expanded into broader issues of ecology, and is about to release a book where he's also looking at mangroves. I think that originally he trained as a geomorphologist, and so he's a scientist of considerable repute. We'll turn now to hear his discussions and his words to help us along on our thoughts, and as I said, to help us progress our deliberations and action for COP26. Turning now to you, Emeritus Professor.
Good morning. I'm talking to you from a wet and windy northeast western part of the United Kingdom, where 2 days ago, this was the scene in one of our towns in the Lake District, the wettest part of England, where they had had 250 millimetres of rain in 24 hours. This is one of the consequences of climate change, the topic we're discussing at this meeting. I am Ian Douglas. I'm an emeritus professor of physical geography from the University of Manchester. And I've been concerned with the environment and human action on the Earth's surface for a long time. These people here are having to adapt to climate change. You can see that the river was breaking its banks 2 days ago, but you can see on the right-hand side what adaptation means for these people. In the last 10 years, they have had their houses flooded at least 3 times by storms that previously would have each been described as a 1 in 100-year storm. This is the increasing severity of extreme events which we've seen the whole world experiencing. Look at these shutters here that they put across the door and the windows of the houses to protect against the flood waters. And we'll be seeing a lot more of this in the coming years if COP26 does not deliver what we're all hoping for out of them. But it's not just COP26 that has got to be involved in working for mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. This slide has a couple of graphs on, but really I want to explain how I got to thinking about climate change. The first slide, the diagram on the left here, is the atmospheric carbon dioxide contribution from 1900 to the present. And you can see it going up steadily in the first half of the 19th century, plateauing there during the Second World War when a lot of activities were constrained. Excuse me. And then rising far more quickly up to the present time. And that's my long lifetime here since the 1930s. And so I have seen this change. Early in my life, in the 1940s and 50s, I can remember the concern was air pollution. Sometimes playing rugby in London, the fog stopped us playing. If you kicked the ball too hard, it would disappear up the pitch into the fog and you wouldn't know where it was. In the 1950s, we had a Clean Air Act, we changed the technology, we stopped burning coal in houses and the air got cleaner. We can overcome environmental problems if we take concerted action. Now, the right-hand slide here tells us that it's not just the carbon dioxide. This graph shows how the actual emissions changed from the predicted emissions. If they were like carbon dioxide close to the predicted emissions, they would have followed roughly along the zero line. But methane gas, which is a very powerful gas, although it's not very long lasting in the atmosphere, is rising enormously. And of course, that comes from natural gas and from livestock, particularly from cattle. And that has an implication for each of us in what we decide to eat and how we use our resources. Now, I personally wrote a book in 1981 about the urban environment, and it was full of things about flooding and air pollution and so on. It didn't particularly emphasize climate change. In 1987, I was invited to a very exciting seminar, week-long seminar in the United States on the Earth as transformed by human action. And there, climate change and the atmospheric gases were discussed very seriously, and we already had the movement towards setting up the IPCC, the Interparliamentary Committee on Climate Change. Now, in 1992, we had the second major international conference on the global environment. And after that, I received a letter from Zina Desh, from the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, a body I had not heard of before, asking me to help in setting up a workshop prior to a post Rio de Janeiro 92 meeting on the global environment, which Zina had attended. And this was the UK's response to the setting up of Local Agenda 21, a movement for towns and cities, local communities to improve what they were doing to improve the world's environment. And at that meeting, there was a very interesting discussion by a man who was arguing that we should allocate resources and limits on emissions according to the world CO2 emissions per capita, which are very, very different from one country to another. I think at the time, Australia had the highest level of CO2 emissions per capita. I'm not exactly sure of the figure, but it might have been 15, whereas in India at that time, it was something like 0.2 or 0.3, very much different. And so it's inequitable in a way to say that everybody should cut at the same rate. Those with the very highest per capita emissions should be cutting much more. And that debate goes on and was part of the background to my small contribution to the IPCC second assessment in 1995, where we wrote about human settlements, the mitigation of the global effects, which include effects on health, effects on global warming, the urban heat island, effects on flooding, effects on biodiversity, and so on. So gradually, climate change was becoming a very major concern in all aspects of examining what was happening to the world's surface. So we have the climate change not as one thing affecting our lives in towns and cities, but as on top of all the other environmental damage that was being driven by towns and cities, the causing of flooding by the paving of the Earth's surface, the effects on human health from the air pollution that was happening within the city, the effects on biodiversity of the changing of the plants and animals in the city, and so on. Now, this is where we have to recognize that what we're talking about at climate change is not an isolated problem. It's a problem that is part of our continuing human transformation of the Earth. Now, for the COP in Copenhagen in 2007, I was asked to prepare a report on climate change, flooding, and the urban poor in Africa. ActionAid is a major charity, and it had focus groups in the informal settlements, the squatter settlements in African cities in the Commonwealth, and they reported back on how people in those settlements adapted to the flooding that they were already experiencing. And we produced a document that was used to lobby the groups at the COP, and this had some effect. At least I was able to find a report about this in the newspaper. And this is the way in which we have to be aware that climate change is not socially uniform in its impact. The weakest and poorest people, the people with the greatest disabilities are going to be affected more than the people who are in the well-off suburbs and so on. So my gradual recognition is that now we are reaching a major upturn, as this curve shows, over time in consideration of the impact of climate change. Now, it's people like Zina Daesh, who I have mentioned and who has inspired people like Margaret Evans and I to really get involved in these issues. She used to influence strongly as many prime ministers she could get hold of. And here she has persuaded the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka in 1985 to sign a message of support for her promotion of human ecology and people taking individual responsibility for the human environment. She was invested with the CNZM in London in about 1999, and your university confirmed the doctor of the university on her in London in 2009. This person showed me how to think about where responsibilities lie. And we're only going to cope with the climate change we've brought upon ourselves by mitigation and adaptation. Now, mitigation means reducing out emissions, cutting out the use of fossil fuels, avoiding deforestation and the burning and emissions that come from that, and all those sorts of things that cause the climate to change. Adaptation, as you saw in the opening slides of Cockermouth, is the preparing for and creating resilience to combat the effects of climate change. This is going on all the time. Now, other kinds of actions are being taken, but I'm suspicious of the carbon offset taxes and things like that, because they are not really producing the change in behavior which we will all have to submit to really get the emissions down. It's paying money for someone to plant a forest somewhere else so that you can continue taking long flights, or you continue to burn oil. This is not really the answer. We have to stop burning oil and we have to stop emissions. So we need to have action of the sort that's going to happen in Glasgow, agreements between nations, the sharing of responsibilities and resources, particularly financial resources, between nations, and particularly the assisting those in need, the people on the low-lying oceanic islands, the people in the crowded deltas like those of the Mekong and the Ganges, Brahmaputra in Asia. We need all that international collaboration. At the national level, we must have the instruments to make sure the targets are achieved, support green technology, and encourage change in agriculture and industry. The shift that's taking towards electric motor vehicles has to be greatly shifted. But we also have to think about, do we all need all the cars we have? I have neighbours with 3 or 4 cars on their paved over front gardens. 1, paving over front gardens is not good for climate change. 2, having all that metal and materials in the cars just standing on the driveways is not good either, neither is driving them. So we have to think of that as how national policies can influence that. Local government needs to be empowered to do what many mayors want to do, to green their cities, to green housing and to green transport. And in the households, we must make sure we've got effective insulation so we don't have to use excessive heating or air conditioning. We have to have low energy design. We have to build, we know how to eco-design houses, and we need it to be mandated in the building regulations. And we need to have our own sustainable lifestyles. So these are all the things that ought to be coming out, and I hope you will see in the next fortnight from Glasgow. So my message is, let's think of measures like greening cities, like bringing nature back into the cities. That's better for biodiversity, better for your own and everybody else's physical and mental health. It's better for your local government, your local environment and the global climate. So I hope you will continue the efforts you're already making. You're obviously concerned because you're coming to these seminars, but we must persuade other people to follow the examples of the leaders who are urging us to green cities, to cut emissions and improve the world. I hope you will enjoy these discussions. We will all learn from them. And I hope that what we try to communicate from CHEC in our daily reports to you in the mornings will be useful to you. Good luck for a very successful seminar. Thank you.
That was great, Professor Ian Douglas, Emeritus Professor at that. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your vast experience that you shared and through the visualization of those case studies, and also providing the actions for us to do every day. Ngā mihi ki a koe. We're turning now to local government, and we heard Professor mention the work of local government to follow in terms of greening the cities. And we're very fortunate to have with us the Mayor of Wanganui District Council, Hamish McDougall. Hamish comes also, as well as being Mayor, with a law and an arts background from University of Otago, immense experience both in local body politics as well as national politics, and overseas experience that he will also bring to his role as Mayor. We're certainly looking forward to hearing about the leadership that you'll be offering Wanganui District Council. So we turn now to you, Mayor Hamish McDougall. Thank you.
Ngā mihi nui ki koutou katoa. My name is Hamish McDougall. I'm the Mayor of Wanganui and the Vice President of Local Government New Zealand. COP26 in Glasgow seems like a big event where governments and global organisations meet. It seems like the other side of the world because it is. It's where you'll find Joe Biden and Billie Eilish and Pope Francis and David Attenborough. But I argue it's vital for us in New Zealand to engage with it. It is imperative that local communities and the people who govern those communities listen and engage with what's happening there. Greta Thunberg has echoed millions of people stating that we need action now. And we as the local government sector are in a unique position of being able to make decisions quickly and nimbly. Whether it's to do with waste minimisation or public transport, or in particular urban planning, so we don't exacerbate emissions, councils throughout New Zealand can make a difference. The Climate Change Commission knows this. The Climate Change Commission urged local government and central government to work together and saw councils as a key partner. Adaptation and resilience, and I'll say mitigation, are key tenets of what we will have to be doing over the next 10 years. I want to acknowledge CHEC, the University of Waikato, and the Honourable Ministers Mahuta and Shaw, who have made it possible to bring COP26 to New Zealand. What a fabulous opportunity to view, interact, and finally implement some of the knowledge and actions that will emerge from this most important global event. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Tēnā koe Mayor Hamish McDowell. Thank you also for your insight and the leadership that you're showing in Wanganui. Now we turn to another local government representative, Councillor Jennifer Nicol, who is part of the Waikato Regional Council, where she chairs the Climate Action Committee for all of local government during this 3 years. She's very committed to sustainability and regenerative systems and speaks about the interconnectedness of us all if we're to have a chance of adapting to climate change. We turn now to you, Councillor Jennifer Nicol.
Kia ora tātou, ko Jennifer Nicol tōku ingoa, ko au te tahi kai kaunihera, mā ngai mō te hapori o Kirikiri Roa, mō te kaunihera arohe o Waikato. My name is Jennifer Nicol and I'm a councillor on the Waikato Regional Council representing the community of Hamilton. I also lead the Climate Action Committee, which is informed by both Western science and Mataranga Māori to help us form our strategy on how to drop emissions in the region and adapt to the impacts of climate change. I'm also involved in the Waikato Plan and the Waikato Wellbeing Project in regards to the climate action mahi. So if any of the above is interesting to you, please get in touch, or if there's a way you can help, I look forward to hearing from you. I have seen a lot of COPs come and go, and I look forward to seeing what this one brings. I want the same I've always wanted for these, which is for the decision makers on the ground to make some strong commitments and strategies to give us the best future possible. Ultimately though, I'm really excited to have been part of the team that is bringing you this streaming event so that you can see how COP26 is relevant to us in the Waikato, and to hear from some amazing voices of local people and others who know a lot about this stuff and can translate it for us as to what's already happening out there and what we can get involved with to make this collective effort to work on the climate action topic together. So I'm just really grateful, and I'm looking forward to sitting alongside virtually everyone to see these sessions happening, and even getting to participate in some of them. And yeah, so have a fantastic time getting to know this topic further and the people on the ground. So, ka kite anō. Enjoy.
Kia ora, Jennifer, and thank you also for your discussions and the work that you're doing in leading the local governments on this journey to help combat and progress our adaptation and mitigation strategies towards climate change. Now we turn to our local and our wonderful Margaret Evans. You met her this morning, former Mayor for Hamilton District Council, and even more energetic citizen committed to change locally, politically, as well as globally. And, you know, Margaret, I didn't know you were an investigative journalist as well. So that's another brand of investigation that you bring. So we're going to turn to you for a few remarks now.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all this morning. I think this is probably a time of a great tidal wave, finally, that is mounting that will change the planet. Hopefully, I'm an optimist. Yes, I'm Margaret Evans, and I was for 9 years the Mayor of Hamilton. I've also had the privilege of being on the executive of Local Government New Zealand. Perhaps over the last 20 years, I've also been involved with Local Governments for Sustainability, which is the group abbreviated down to ICLE, International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, which came out of the Rio Earth Summit Conference. And of course, right now, I'm very, very proud to belong to the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, which is partnering with the University of Waikato today. I could spend the next hour or so or more going back over the last 50 years, talking about all of the talk that has beamed all around the world. What I think is most important, though, as we look backwards, to remember that there have been thousands, probably millions of people all around the world who have been quietly beavering away, making changes to their practices in villages in Africa and villages in India, throughout the Pacific Islands, and certainly here in New Zealand, because they understood that change was needed. We're now talking about things like the circular economy, regenerative farming, but we're also talking about things like, we don't like monocultural pines being seen everywhere. We would sooner see the restoration of the indigenous forest. We don't like seeing sewage pipes breaking or pouring into our river when there are many, many other ways in which we can treat our own wastes. We also don't like to see issues of poverty in this country. And we remind ourselves that it wasn't for all of those little NGOs, non-government organisations, or small groups of people working kānuhi ki te kānuhi, face to face with people in need, we would be much worse off. So what I want to see out of this next 2 weeks, not just in Glasgow and COP26, but here in Hamilton, here in New Zealand, can we harness all our efforts? Can we understand what's going on all over the place, where groups of people are working and now need greater support? I think that's the big dream. This is not just public sector and private sector working together. This is public sector, private sector, and people everywhere. P, because we've had all of the expressions such as planet and people, but perhaps the most important expression of all is sustainability. The one thing that we all understand is that we are living today, but we want life for tomorrow as well. That's the underpinning theme of COP26. Climate change is about sustainability and is about the ongoing future of this planet and its people. Kaitiakitanga says it all. That should be our theme. So kia ora tātou. Thank you all for contributing. May we have a splendid 2 weeks and become reinvigorated and really seek the changes.
Kia ora, Margaret, and thank you too for your wise guidance and those wisdoms that you've shared. Our last speaker for today is Associate Professor Tom Raw. Many of you, I'm sure, already know about our Tom Raw and his reputation. Not only has he been a tribal leader ever since he was, well, for so long, he's also a linguist, a historian, committed to Māori and tribal development. And so we're going to turn to him now. Tēnā koe, Tom. Pai kia kiti ia koe me te whakarongo ki tō kōrero, tēnā nō koe.
Tihei mauri ora. Ki te whai au ki te ao marama. Thank you everyone for joining us in this panel, to the panelists, to those who have shared their thoughts, shared their hopes, shared their aspirations in this local initiative response to the global initiative of COP26. With the university's IT and other capabilities, we aim to curate a way for people to make connections locally and globally with COP26. And very grateful for the support of Ministers Mahuta and Shaw, in particular for the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council and their status as an NGO at the conference in Glasgow. So our focus in these panels is highlighting Māori, Indigenous, local voices, reflecting our grassroots support of rangi and papa, of their children, of our environment. There's a particular urgency for Indigenous communities, as we are the most vulnerable in the threat and the spiralling damage of the effects of climate change. So all of you, all of us who are working to affect those effects, tēnā koutou. This panel kicks the week off for us here locally. And I'm very grateful personally, but also professionally, to those people who have shared their thoughts, and would welcome the thoughts of all of you who are tuned in. With the question, what do you think you might want, we might want, from COP26? Our plan is to ask you to send thoughts in to our university website, and from that, make up a little chart. These are the expectations, these are the aspirations, these are the hopes from COP26 in Glasgow with respect to our local initiative. When the conference completes and finishes, wraps up at the end of next week, we will have a feedback, and let's see from that table how many ticks we can put in where COP26 actually realised something from our local Waikato region, hopes and aspirations in that space. Bueno, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, te ora hui hui tātou katoa.
Tēnā koe, Tom. Tēnā koe me e rā whakaro me e rā wero mo te iwi no reira anō nei ngā mahi. Well, that brings us to the end of this afternoon's discussions. We've been very fortunate, I think, to hear a range of speakers from all disciplines, starting with our Professor Ian Douglas, for a beautiful framing of some of the work that he's done. As I said earlier, using the visual impacts of case studies that he was witness to just most recently in terms of his hometown. And then starting to give us what some of the figures look like, but more importantly, also to give us some of the actions. We thank Hamish McDowell as well for the leadership that he's showing in Wanganui District Council and as leader of the local government forum of mayors in climate change as well. Councillor Jennifer McNichol, we know, doing a very, very important work on the ground at Waikato Regional Council. And Margaret, for your consistent and sustained efforts to keep us all honest and answerable, in fact, to Papatūānuku through this concept of kaitiakitanga, which you continually remind us of. Actually, I was thinking you're not unlike Xenodeus, so ngā mihi ki a koe. And to you, Tom, we know that in this day and age, where we've got so many problems, that one knowledge system is no longer appropriate. We need to deal with more than one knowledge system, and in that way our introductory speech by our Honourable Nanaia Mahuta also brought that framework into her discussions, which will be government-led. So we also thank Nanaia Mahuta for not only, as I said earlier, clearly articulating a plan, especially in these times of uncertainty, but also ensuring that we can see ourselves in that plan so that we can all commit to the actions, because in the end, and from what I could gather from these discussions, it was about leadership. And we've heard from that leadership today through government, local government, on the ground, and through civil society groups. We've also heard about the value of working together, mahi tahi, whether it be the public sector, as Margaret said, the private sector. In the end, they all compose of people, and we're looking to people power to create this transformative change. And as people power, we all can ensure that the governments commit to action and do better than what they've done in the past. And lastly, we heard this also from our Honorary Minister, we've heard it again from Margaret, and we've heard it from Tom, this whole concept of kaitiakitanga. Our spiritual connections back to the land are intertwined, are interlinked. As many Māori tribes have shown us in their fight to be recognised within the courts, we are the river and the river is us, is one example of the dictum that we are using. Ko au te awa, ko te awa ko au. And that all is finally embedded within Earth Mother and Sky Father, from whence the saying comes, te hei mauri ora, ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama. Ngā mihi kia koutou, I hono hono mai ki tēnei kōrero, ko tēnei te rā tuatahi, hei a popa, hei a popo, hei te rā wiki, he kōrero anō kei te hike, nō reira I roto I te rā, ka nui ngā mihi kia tātou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
The University of Waikato is proud to introduce the world's first Bachelor of Climate Change. For the people who know there is no planet B, gain the skills needed for the jobs of tomorrow. Contribute to a fundamental shift in the way we do business and go about our lives. Explore how Mātauranga Māori can bring perspective to the most pressing issue of our time. Apply now and carve a career where passion and purpose collide.